Heavenly Father, today we put on the full armor to protect us against attack. We put on the belt of truth to protect against lies and deception. We put on the breastplate of righteousness to protect our hearts from the temptations. We put the gospel of peace on our feet to walk in your light, peace, and freedom with the Holy Spirit. We rebuke anxious thoughts. We take up your shield of faith for protection to block and destroy all the darts and threats thrown at us by the enemy. We put on the helmet of salvation to cover our minds and thoughts, reminding us that we are children of a mighty King. We are forgiven, set free, saved by the blood of Jesus. We take up the sword of the Spirit, your living word, that has the power to demolish strongholds and is sharper than any double-edged sword. We come to you, Lord, in prayer daily. In Jesus' mighty name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
What's up, you guys? Welcome to The Imagination. I'm your host, Emma, and I just know you're all going to be just as excited as I am for today's episode. Joining me this week for the third time on the show is Matty, California native, forbidden and self-taught historian specializing in the occult, secret societies, and hidden history, athlete, independent researcher, investigative journalist, and newest to the list, he is now an official counterculture filmmaker. He recently debuted his first documentary film called Blood on the Palms, and let me tell you what, it does not disappoint. The documentary dives deep into an extraordinary and mind-bending murder mystery case involving one of the richest men in the world that took place in 1943, and the journey down a deep, dark rabbit hole that Matty and his incredible film team take us down is nothing short of astounding. I have personally watched Blood on the Palms twice now, and both times it both took my breath away and left me in a deep train of thought. I'm really excited to dive deeper into this story today and for Matty to blow us away per usual with his inquisitive mind and brilliant discoveries as he untangles the knots of some of the biggest secrets in the world. I have had so many requests for Matty to come back, and I know it's going to be a really fun conversation. And I love how many of you have commented how refreshing it is to see such a young man take on such a massive role in this fight for truth and for our children, and I couldn't agree more. Matty's just beginning his journey, and I know his impact will help change the world for the better for generations to come. I'm grateful his generation has a role model like him and can't wait for many more conversations as Matty continues to break barriers both in his filmmaking and in his research. Without further ado, I'm honored to have back this week young hero, voice for the voiceless, man of God, and renowned historian, Matty. Thank you so much for being here with me today, Matty.
It's my pleasure as always. I really appreciate that introduction. I mean, you've certainly set quite an expectation for today's show. I hope I can live up to it.
I think you're going to way surpass it if we're being honest here. So it's been a little while since you've been on, and I know that there's a million different things that we could cover today. And obviously I'm not too set on just, focusing on one thing, but I really wanted to just catch people up on what you've been up to since we've talked last and what's been going on in your life, because you have been busy.
Yeah. So we, my co-producer, Will, and I, we released Blood on the Palms. I believe it was April 27th. I took probably 3 weeks off after that to just kind of see how people were feeling about it, send it to all the different authors that we worked with, and just kind of take a break, because that was like a nonstop year-long process regarding like research and production and learning about how to make films and all that. Since then, I've been setting course for my next film, which I'm planning to release ideally in August or September. There's a few things that are a little bit up in the air regarding that, but it generally in that range. So I've been researching this one for about a year as well. It's just kind of been a topic that I'm really passionate about. And I mean, I'm putting everything into it. I thought that's what I did with Blood on the Palms. And I mean, I don't want to cut myself short. I did. But I mean, as far as everything, sound, production value, cinematography, the whole thing, I think that I can really make something groundbreaking with this next one. And I'm really excited about it.
Gosh, congratulations. What a huge feat. And I know I said this before we started recording, but the film that you just created, Blood on the Palms, the quality was just incredible. I was so blown away by not just the research you did, but you guys hunted down video clips, you guys hunted down old photography, you guys hunted down old history, details about these people that I hadn't even heard of some of these people, and my biggest question for you whenever I was watching this was what drew you to this story in particular? Because you've been studying so many different stories. What was it about this one that really stood out to you?
Yeah. So gosh, it's been about 2 years now since Will and I got started, and we originally had a project in mind that was going to involve this basically this research team that was searching for the Holy Grail in Argentina. And when all the lockdowns and travel bans happened, we kind of just shelved that, and we were looking for something that we could do that was kind of close by. And so we found out we kind of heard murmurs about this island, Darby Island, where we go in the film, and we heard rumors that it was used as a refilling station for Nazi U-boats during World War II, which was nothing we'd ever heard before, obviously. And the fact that it was just like this abandoned island with a castle right in the middle of it, in the middle of the Bahamas, we were like, well, this is incredible. Let's see if we can go there and shoot some film and just kind of figure it out. And I researched, I just kind of tried to dig as much as I could on it. And I found this whole case that was, 80 years old next year that I'd never heard of. And there was all sorts of stories about it, in like the 40s through the 70s, and you just don't really hear anything about it again. And the story is, absolutely ridiculous with all the people that it encompasses and the amount of intrigue and all of this. And the deeper I went, as it always goes, the more kind of obsessed I became with it. And the fact that it had never really been definitively solved, it's kind of just a challenge that I took myself. And so we probably spent another 6 months researching before we just said, all right, well, we have enough money. I just graduated and let's just go. So we flew to the Bahamas, and we didn't know what we were doing. We had a cinematographer, Daniel, who was great, and we just went for it. We went to Darby Island, and we continued researching more afterwards. And we certainly stumbled our way through it, being that we had not the first clue how to make a film when we started, but it really became this incredible project at the end.
It was fantastic. And it seemed to me just through watching it, I loved how we got to see in real time through your eyes. It almost seemed like you guys had just a couple questions that you figured that you'd get answers to, and that it would stop, right? And as you see, it's like really in real time, you're going through and you're uncovering things while you're there, which to me was really amazing, because it added so much drama almost to it, where it has you on the edge of the seat, like, oh my gosh, the web just keeps growing and this story just gets deeper and deeper.
Yeah. So we only had, because of our budget, we paid for this, with all the money we had saved up. We only had 3 days to shoot. And the first day,
Gosh,
I couldn't be there because my passport got lost in the mail. So I couldn't travel to the Bahamas. I was sitting there in Miami at Will's house while he and Daniel were waiting for me in Nassau. And I just like sat in his driveway for about 12 hours until the package finally got there. And so I had to take another flight. And so we really only had about maybe 60 hours total to film. So we were spending about 15 hours, out like just sun up till sundown filming. And then we would sit in the room and we would research and we would discuss things. And so there was only so much, I guess, we could really do. Like we had to kind of limit our expectations for what we could get on the island. And on this first day, like the first day I got there, it kind of hit me like, wow, there has to be another angle here with the amount of Masonic things that are very clearly present here on Nassau, on Bay Street, where like the main antagonists of this story exists. And so I started kind of mulling it over and thinking, who these players were and who they were connected to, and reviewing the story that I'd read like 70 times, and it finally hit me, there has to be a bigger connection here. And so we were like, okay, we're going to go to the island. We kind of have this idea in our heads, but the story will keep going when we get home. And so I spent another 5 months researching, going through like family trees, that trace these families back to like 1780 or so, trying to kind of get down to the bottom of it. And I really think that by the end of it, I think we really have told the most complete story of this case that's like ever been done in history. And we spoke to a couple of best-selling authors who wrote about this story. We spoke to a guy, Pat Wertheim, who is a forensic examiner who had been writing about this case since I think the 1970s, and they all seem to think that we got it right. So I guess, in a certain way it's beginner's luck, but we went in kind of with, I guess, a broad enough perspective that you have as a beginner to look into alternative perspectives, and it really paid off.
It did. And you could tell that you guys came to this really groundbreaking. I don't think it's fully conclusive. It seems like there's
Right.
still more. I know you said even after the film you were researching. So
Mhm.
that's one of the things that I loved about it was after I got done watching it, I still was like, oh my gosh, I have so many things going through my head. I have so many questions about this. This is
Mhm.
really groundbreaking. And how have I never heard about this case? So
Mhm.
let's kind of go back to where this started. So
Sure.
let's talk about maybe what first attracted you to the story, and then let's build on that and talk about some of what you guys discovered in the film.
Sure. Yeah. So the like once I got into the researching and kind of um got like a wide picture of the historical context that this story was in, um came away with this picture of the Bahamas that you don't really get, just because it's seen as like more or less just like a travel destination. It's not a
Yeah.
place that has any sort of concise history. And what it turns out is that it was essentially the Wild West all the way up until maybe the 1980s. But okay, so it was an English colony, and you had these elite English families that lived there that basically controlled the island, both politically and economically, and they set the laws for it. And it was basically kind of just seen as this place where you went to get rich and do as you please. Um, and so its proximity to Florida made it a really ideal place for illicit activities that would normally go on in the United States. They could go on there because there was no law essentially. It was like kind of the idea of the American frontier, where like if you were an outlaw, you would go out there and you would just never be heard from again. So that made it a really ideal place at the turn of the century, especially like during Prohibition, for the mafia to be involved with rum running activities. So families that had previously been involved in things like importing and exporting, construction, lumber, whatever, were now running rum for like Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky, who were like the most powerful gangsters in the world at their time. And so once that happened, the Bahamas just kind of became a place where anything went. And that to me was like astounding, that as a whole. But it only gets crazier because that notion of it being this English protectorate that was kind of an anything goes place for people of wealth, and then for like Bahamian slave descendants, it became a place where people from England who didn't maybe go along with the governmental conditions there could assist enemies that were at war with England, basically. And so that's where these English and eventually a broader European elite could finance the Nazi war effort during World War II. And so the Bahamas is just kind of this totally unique place that I had never heard anything about before. And it was clearly, it had to have been ripe with stories, right? And so I dove right in, and that's where the story of the murder of Harry Oakes comes in, which is all the more interesting.
And had you heard of Harry Oakes? Was that a character that you had read about before that drew you to this, or did that come about as you were researching the Bahamas?
No, so I went into this with no knowledge of this at all. The only thing I had heard about was the rumors about Darby Island, which seemed to me to be ludicrous because it would make no sense seemingly. And so as I learned more about this history of the Bahamas, eventually I came upon this story, the murder of Harry Oakes, and how the fact that it's like this cold case that involves seemingly all these powerful people across the world, and there's all sorts of rumors, but none of them are conclusively kind of proven, um, which was due in part to the fact that the Bahamas was controlled under the control, top to bottom, from a very powerful elite, and there was nobody underneath to keep them in check. The idea of a free press was like hardly a concept in anywhere in the world, America even, and so there's nobody in the Bahamas that would do anything to let this story out. It was basically you were either involved in it or you really had no idea what was going on. Um, and so it really it's 80 years later, it's still been able to be contained within the island itself, which is so fascinating. Um, it truly, I think even a documentary doesn't do it justice, really. I think that somebody should do like a true Hollywood movie about it, because it's this incredible murder mystery that involves so much luxury and so many players from across the world. I find it truly fascinating. I don't know where else you want me to go there specifically, but that's basically how I got to the story.
Yeah, let's talk about Harry Oakes and who he was, and let's talk about the strange circumstances surrounding his, murder, death.
Sure, sure. So Harry Oakes he was Canadian. Well, he was from Maine actually, but he ended up moving to Canada, and he tried to be a gold prospector. He was just kind of a farm boy, for lack of a better term, and he would go to Canada year after year to try and make it rich, and nothing. Year after year, nothing. He was broke, and he got a loan from, I believe it was his sister, and she told him, all right, this is the last chance. We'll let you try and dig for gold one more time, but other than that, this is it. And so he goes to, I believe it was the Yukon, and he strikes it rich. Somehow he'd found that under this frozen lake there was like the largest deposit of gold in the world at the time, and so he goes from being dead broke to like the second richest man in the world overnight. Um, and so I think he had about $500 million in like 1930 money. So something in the neighborhood of billions today, as if you could go from being broke to like the third richest man in the world today, making $100 billion. It's obviously very ludicrous. And so he didn't really know what he wanted to do, obviously, because why would you? You don't expect to make it that rich. So he goes to the Bahamas. And his first day, he gets to the Bahamas. He's a very humble man. He never let money change him. So he goes to the most expensive hotel in the Bahamas, and he's in his prospecting clothes still, his rough gold mining clothes. And one of the employees at this hotel, which I went to, I believe it's a Hilton now, but they go up to him and they go, "Excuse me, sir, I don't think you're supposed to be here." And Harry Oakes was a very proud man, and he looked at him and he said, "Okay," and he left. And he goes back the next day and he buys the hotel and fires that guy. So his entry into the Bahamas was kind of as this, who is this guy? He's just this incredibly rich man who seemingly can do whatever he wants. And in his mind, I'm sure he probably thought, well, this is my island now. But he didn't realize that there was this kind of cabal, for lack of a better term, of English royalty that controlled the island's interest itself, and that included the mafia. And so eventually he gets absorbed into it. He gets absorbed into this group that is in history is known as the Bay Street Boys, but what we found, it was actually just a Masonic lodge that existed on Bay Street. So it was all of the rich, connected Englishmen that controlled all the functions of the island. So that included lawyers, real estate agents, land magnates who, like the Bay Street Boys, for example, controlled 80% of the land in the Bahamas. They owned all of it. And they can every function, construction, shipping, whatever. It was all consolidated in this one lodge. And Harry Oakes inevitably, because he's rich, all of these guys hear about him. I'm sure he starts going to their dinners and whatnot, absorbed into their society, their social club. And so he's doing business with them because he wants to make money still, of course. And so Harold Christie, who was basically the real estate agent in the Bahamas, who he was originally a rum runner for Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky. They basically did deals together where Harry Oakes would finance construction on all of these different properties or land that were owned by the Bay Street Boys, and Harold Christie would broker the deals. And so they were making a lot of money together, developing the Bahamas into this destination. But Harold Christie was not a very honest man, and he would do certain things. He would make certain deals and agreements with Harry Oakes, and he wouldn't go through with them. And Harry Oakes obviously was a very proud man, as I already told you, and he didn't like that. So he threatened Harold Christie he said, I'm going to call in all of the loans that you owe me. You're not honest. I don't want to do business with you anymore. And Harold Christie was basically, without Harry Oakes knowing, or with him knowing, that there's some conjecture on this, had a plan to build casinos in the Bahamas. They were going to basically build a casino empire with the mob controlling it through Meyer Lansky. And when the mob is involved on a deal, you don't back out. So Harold Christie couldn't tell Meyer Lansky, hey, all of that money that was going to make us, hundreds of millions of dollars, it's not going to happen. So basically what Harold Christie did was he contacted Meyer Lansky in Miami and said, this is an emergency. I need you to take care of this. So Meyer Lansky dispatches a couple of assassins by speedboat to the Bahamas, and they go to Harry Oakes' house at night after a dinner party. And Harold Christie was in the house because he was very good friends with Harry Oakes at the time, notwithstanding their business problems. And he was staying at his house, and the assassins come in through the door and they kill Harry Oakes. They beat him to death with a pickaxe or an ice pick. It depends on who you hear it from. And they were going to torch the house, but there was a storm. And so the water, the rain puts out the fire. And Harold Christie wakes up the next morning, has no idea what happened, goes into the room of his friend Harry Oakes and sees he's dead. And that's our story, more or less.
I thought it was really interesting, just the fact that, you have this man, like you said, he seemingly stumbles on all this wealth. His life changes overnight, but he's obviously very ignorant in a sense about like how the world works and how power structures work. He didn't get into power the same way that a lot of these people did. You have royalty, you have probably generational secret society and occult members, you have lawyers, you have people that were, ushered into this affluent society on this random island, that was chosen for all of this. And all of a sudden he's intermingling in there, and and at least it seemed like, to your knowledge, he wasn't involved in any Freemasonry or cultism. He had those humble beginnings and came into this as almost somebody who was a little bit ignorant on how this worked and had no idea, that there's things more powerful than money out there that can, supersede the things that he was doing, and that he was dabbling and getting to know people and situations and things that, they didn't want him getting involved with and knowing
Right.
about, and, being more powerful then.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, that's really the kind of the sad aspect of this story, is that Harry Oakes, much like any other person who strikes it rich overnight, except he struck it rich, on a scale much greater than anybody strikes it rich overnight. They don't realize that money comes with all sorts of conditions, and it comes with all sorts of people that odds are know more about dealing with money than you do. And so the truth of the matter is he just thought money talked because that's all he knew. He didn't grow up in any sort of legacy family. He didn't grow up in any sort of old boys network, because if he did, he wouldn't have been panhandling in Canada to try and strike it rich with gold. So, and it happened in a very short time. over a span of a few years, he got way in over his head with probably dealings that he didn't know were happening. If I had to guess, I don't think he ever would have known that Harold Christie was mob connected. Um, and the other thing is that the story, I mean, I kind of gave a bit of an elevator pitch on that first one, but there's another component, which is that you had the royal family who was involved with Nazi Germany during the war. And so a little bit of context on that. Um, King Edward the Eighth was originally the King of England, but he was a very big fan of Nazi Germany, and he gave a speech at one point while he was king, basically saying that England should ally with Nazi Germany during the war. He was a very big embarrassment to the royal family, and so they asked that he step down, and he did. Um, he abdicated to, I believe, his brother George the Sixth. Maybe I might be wrong on that, but they they basically said, like, look, you're not doing the right thing here. We just need to get rid of this kind of publicity firestorm. So why don't you go be governor of the Bahamas? We own the island. It'll be good for you there. Go get some rest, go to the beach, whatever. And so he was planning to do that. However, there was this operation or this plan that Hitler set out to basically kidnap King Edward, to bring him to Germany to kind of negotiate some sort of arrangement with him there. It was known as Operation Veely. It doesn't end up happening. It was supposed to happen on a hunting trip in Spain. It was unsuccessful, but he goes to the Bahamas and he takes control there effectively, because nonetheless, it is an English island. And the component that's really interesting here is that King Edward was himself a Freemason, and he loved Freemasonry so much that he wouldn't resign from his duty while as king, which never happens. He was a master Mason, and he goes to the Bahamas, and it turns out that there's all sorts of English legacy there already that's kind of holding it down, and there's a Masonic lodge that's holding it down, and so undoubtedly he was involved in their operation, and he was involved in their business operation. So he was, associated with Harry Oakes. He was associated with Harold Christie. He was associated with all of them. And there was one other guy who was also in the fold named Axel Wennergren, who was another one of the three richest men in the world, who his business is Krupp, KRUPP, was an arms dealing company, a corporation, whatever you want to call it, that was supplying weapons to everybody during the war. And then he also owned the Electrolux vacuum company. He moved to the Bahamas and founded the first bank there. And so they were all working together. It's really fascinating when I found this out, but you have he was a Nazi financier, Axel Wennergren was. He also went with Heinrich Himmler to South America and financed some of the Nazis' archaeological digs looking for like occult things in South America. So he was very connected to the Third Reich. He was very connected to like Hitler's top administration, like Martin Bormann, Heinrich Himmler, people like that. Connected to the King of England, or the former King of England, the richest man in the world, or one of the richest men in the world, Harry Oakes, and then this kind of entrenched group of people who owned the Bahamas. They were all working together. Oh, and the mafia. How can I forget that? They're all working together, kind of doing these shady business dealings to develop the Bahamas. And much of that money they were funding to the Nazi war effort. The Bay Street Boys were, as was Axel Wennergren, as was the King of England. And so you have money going to all these different people, and Harry Oakes just kind of standing there in the middle writing the checks. And so obviously this sort of business arrangement that has so many different mouths being fed is so tightly wound that if anyone's string breaks, whether it be somebody gets caught sending money to Nazi Germany, perhaps, there's a firestorm, a publicity firestorm. And so they have to keep the machine running. And that's why when Harry Oakes threatens to cut all the loans, they had to get rid of him. And so we have every reason to think that once he was killed, his money was taken and used to fund that effort. We were able to get in contact with a forensic accountant who we had to keep anonymous because of his request, who has paperwork that shows that the royal family received the rest of Harry Oak's fortune after his death. And he died. There was this major trial where they framed this guy named Freddie DeMarini, who was he lived in the Bahamas, but he was basically an outsider. Totally like sham trial. They forged his fingerprint, throughout his alibi, and nonetheless, the case was so fraudulent that they still couldn't convict him. But he was banished from the island, and so Harold Christie obviously was never caught. Nobody was ever caught doing this. It's just kind of this like weird open shut case, and anybody who talks about it tends to just get some threats, and they're silenced. We talked to a couple of authors who had written about this. There was one case of somebody who I believe was Harold Christie's secretary, who claimed that she knew who was really behind it, and she was murdered in like the 70s. There was another writer, a newspaper writer in Nassau, that we had heard from a mutual friend was writing that the case was being covered up, and he had gunshots shot through his window. And it's still a contentious case to this day. Like nobody would really talk to us about it in the Bahamas. So it's, I mean, I could go on about it for hours, but the fact that nobody knows about this is unbelievable.
Oh, I completely agree. And I was thinking, I want to play, since we were just talking about Freemasonry and just that aspect, I'd love to play this little clip that I brought
Yeah.
up. I have a couple other questions about that, but I think that this little clip is really interesting with the history that it displays, and then also some of the ways that you see these secret societies invisibly infiltrating society, while the rest of society still idolizes them and doesn't realize the undertone of the situation that they're looking at on TV or on the news or in the newspaper at that time.
Sure.
Let me see. Here we go. Okay, so I'm going to bring this up, and then afterwards we can talk about it a little bit. But I really loved how, first of all, well done this whole movie was, but the scene is really, really fascinating. So I'm going to go ahead and bring this up, and let me move this little thing. All right, here we go.
Well, yes, secretive, very secretive.
We got to the Bahamas thinking we knew the whole story. As we walked the streets of Nassau, particularly the once illustrious Bay Street, signs and symbols seemed to keep suggesting that a story even bigger than we imagined was lying just beneath the surface. Eager to discover what we might be missing in this murder case, we couldn't help but notice that Bay Street in particular was screaming the presence of Freemasonry. Obelisks, solar icons, and even the famous square and compass littered Bay Street leading up to what was a very large, and as we found out, a very active Masonic lodge. But what could that possibly have to do with the Bay Street Boys and the endeavors of Harry Oakes and Harold Christie? After deep diving Bahamian history, Masonic encyclopedias, and the heritage of many of our key players, we found an unbelievable amount of previously unknown information to substantiate our theory. As we dug and dug, the difficulty became not proving that Freemasonry was integral to this story, but instead finding at what point it actually stopped. For those that might not know, Freemasonry is a mystical and secret society, replete with ancient rituals and an unknown origin. While some date Freemasonry to the 18th century in England or Scotland, others date Masonry all the way back to the Old Testament of the Bible. Although it is often hard to separate what is fact and fiction when discussing Masonry, the list of known Masonic brothers is equally astounding. Known Freemasons of US fame include names like George Washington, Teddy Roosevelt, Andrew Jackson, J. Edgar Hoover, Ben Franklin, and hundreds of other famous names covering the history books. Of the 24 official and known members of the Bay Street Boys, at least 17 of them were known Freemasons, including major players like attorney and politician Stafford Sands, land magnate Guy Baxter, and the premier of the Bahamas, Roland Simonet. Not only this, but many of the Bay Street Boys had both influential fathers and sons who became Freemasons. like former Deputy Prime Minister Brent Simonet, or Sovereign Grand Commander of the Freemasons, Basil L. Sands. The Bay Street Boys during the 1940s owned 80% of the Bahamas land, made up the entirety of the ruling political party known as the UBP, were industry leaders who built the nation from the ground up, and all of them happened to be brothers of the same Masonic lodge right there on Bay Street. Calling this group of men the Bay Street Boys is a perfect example of the Bahamian public seeing a group of powerful individuals working together to further each other's ends without realizing what the source of their collaboration was. The power structure of the Bahamas was inseparable from Freemasonry, with its brother Masons controlling the island's every function in order to make themselves richer and gain more power. What the Bay Street Boys did not expect, though, was that they would be visited by a famous brother from another country. Edward VIII loved Freemasonry. He wrote that it was one of the most influential forces in his life, and was even initiated as a Masonic Grand Master. In his short time as king, Edward even loved Freemasonry so much that he refused to resign from his Masonic duties as a king normally would. He was undoubtedly pleased to find upon his banishment to the Bahamas that he would be right at home amongst his Masonic brothers in a lodge that dominated the Bahamas. The secret sauce of Freemasonry that makes it so beneficial for doing business is their secrets and how they keep them. At every degree of initiation, Freemasons take oaths of loyalty to their brothers, and oaths to keep the secrets of their brothers secret forever. These oaths are protected by a penalty of a gruesome death, and this Masonic death penalty for sharing secrets has been acted on many times before. When combining the resources, connections, political power, and trust signed in blood that the Bay Street Boys and King Edward VIII could count on during their time in the Bahamas, they were able to oversee the creation of a multifaceted plan to gain power, money, and global influence.
Wow. That's so neat that you were able to get a lot of that footage and take pictures of those monuments and dig up pictures of those people. In your mind, do you suspect that more than just 17 of these Bay Street Boys had Masonic involvement or involvement in other secret societies or the occult?
I mean, if I were betting on it, I would guess that it was probably something like 23 or 24 of the 24. I mean, it just, I had to do like kind of just an insufferable amount of research to pick this stuff up because there's just not a lot of genealogical information about the Bahamas. So I was reading like newspaper articles from 1920 and stuff, which is difficult because they fade quite a bit. But these families that were making these decisions were all intermarrying. And so obviously that means then they all know each other and they've all known each other for generations. So the odds that, these families could be associated for something like 5-6 generations, and a bunch of them would all be in the social club, but some of them wouldn't be. It just seems ludicrous. It's just that some of them you couldn't get any information on at all. And so, yeah, without saying I'm deathly certain that it's all of them, I'm pretty sure it's all of them.
Yeah. What I think is fascinating and that we're seeing uncover more and more, in your case is this case in particular is not an exception, is how islands are kind of a piece to this puzzle that I don't think people in normal society really think about because they're so isolated from the land that we know.
Yeah.
And you can also tell, I lived in Las Vegas for, over a decade, and you see this beautiful tourist destination built atop of a massive, I don't want to say secret society necessarily, but mob town, almost to distract people from what's actually going on there. They put these things there that draw people there to fund money, and just like the casinos, same thing as the Bahamas.
Yeah.
And so people don't, the space that they are dominating and that they're doing really facetious things on is looked at and recognized as the tourist destination and not as this underground crime belt.
Yeah. And Hollywood would be another example of that. The same group of, the founders of Hollywood are as well Masons, Louis B. Mayer, Cecil B. DeMille, these, I think it's just kind of a turn of the century phenomenon, I guess, just based on where a lot of the world was in terms of real estate development, that there were these groups um, that were all tightly knit and were able to access the financing to basically set up their own kingdoms, for lack of a better term, on their own terms. And, they were able to rule them because law enforcement is either under their thumb, or B, it just isn't equipped to kind of handle the scope of power, I guess you would say.
100%. And one of the things that I've learned, not only through you, in the other episodes I did, but through other survivors, is it seems like these secret societies like to massage themselves into society by going to a remote town that basically dictates itself. It has its own police force. It has, its own municipal buildings. It has its own government almost. And a lot of them, the people involved in those divisions of society, are also in these secret societies. So it's almost like its own governing, nation, in a sense, within a nation that's kind of disconnected from the rest of the things around it. And so again, a lot of crimes able to take place when the police officers or the judges in the courts or other authority figures are involved also in, being born into maybe a blood family or a royal family, maybe generational occultism or Freemasonry. And so you almost have these little pockets everywhere, but they look so good on the outside and things are covered up so well. They're known as being these really safe, great areas on the outside. And so it flies under the radar, just like this mystery did. I'm sure they buried it. And again, because it's on the Bahamas, you either probably had to live there or, see a rare news clip. I'm sure they didn't air it a lot of places because they, just cut it off like, hey, we're not going to talk about this anymore.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a bunch there that comes to mind. I guess the first thing is just you saying that it hasn't been aired very much. You're right. We went to the Nassau Tribune in the film, and the people there were very nice. We were asking about the case and all that, and they directed us to their archives. And we read the original series. A guy named Etienne Depew, who was a Bay Street boy, covered the both the murder and the trial as it was happening. And the case had been so sanitized because it was being every data point was being controlled by the King Edward, who took a personal case, who basically assigned himself lead investigator on the murder case, so that we were reading, it was frustrating because we were excited, like, oh, of course we can hear everything as if it was actually there. And we had more information that we were able to find ourselves than the original newspaper articles from 1943. And that's just such a long, sustained story that you can really, like, when in a case like this, you can really acutely see just how power is able to dictate whether it be news or the law or whatever. And the truth of the matter is, that's kind of like horrifying, is that these families, whether it be like the families that make up the Bay Street Boys, or families that make up, let's say, corporations, for example, they operate on these kind of 500-year-old scales, where, take for example, like Louis Rosenstiel, who he was he was an associate of J. Edgar Hoover. He founded the Seagram's liquor company, but he was kind of the first guy who mainstreamed the sexual blackmail thing in America. He became rich around the same period as Harry Oakes did, and this is a thing I'm kind of working on now. It's just like my own personal research passion, but the story is that he was in the French Riviera and he ran into Winston Churchill. This is probably about 1918, I think. Or no, I think it was during Prohibition. Yeah. He talks to Winston Churchill, and Winston Churchill says to him, hey, be ready for prohibition to end, which is just preposterous. But his uncle, Lewis Rosenstiel, ran this distiller of whiskey in Kentucky. And so Lewis Rosenstiel thinks, oh, all right, well, I should be prepared for prohibition to end. He buys up a ton of alcohol distilleries for pennies on the dollar. Prohibition ends, and he's the largest maker of alcohol in the country, which that's like the historical normal story about it. But what you don't realize, or what I didn't realize until I researched it, was that there's very good reason to believe, first of all, that Lewis Rosenstiel may be related to Winston Churchill. But nonetheless, I did all of his genealogy, and he's a descendant of like two incredibly powerful families, the Davis family and the Johnson family. The Johnson family is the SC Johnson family, right? So like $60 billion that he was descended from that family line. But he was also descended from signers of the Declaration of Independence. He was descended from a series of Freemasons on both sides, and he was descended from the French royal family, so Napoleon's family, going back to that time. And so the point is like these individuals who are involved in the secret inner workings of society are not lonely atoms. They're not single points of intrigue. Like people don't fall into those positions. And whether it be through just familial association, whether it be both through familial association, wealth, and secret society association, these families have been playing a game that's older than the United States, often in many cases. And so it's not quite as simple as just like, well, let's just catch them. Let's catch this one murder, and then like the problem's solved. It's that these are systems that produce all sorts of bad outcomes. And it is horrifying to think that way, but the more I look into it, the more it stems from that.
Well, it makes sense. I know the last time that we worked together, we talked about, serial killers was a theme, and how in society, on the outside looking in, we watch the news and we see this one horrific person that committed these unspeakable crimes, and they're arrested or something happens, problem solved, we wipe our hands and think, oh, it's gone. But upon researching it, you realize that there was no lone wolf, even in those situations, that there was a group of people that colluded to make things happen. Mm-hmm. And the connections to a lot of these really infamous cases are connected to really affluent, famous, royal families and people. Mm-hmm. And I think that too is horrific, because in our mind, we go back to doing whatever we're doing, thinking problem solved, when mm-hmm. that's just a little tiny tip of the iceberg of what the actual, situation or problem was. It's just, we don't get broadcast all that information.
Right. Yeah, no, you're 100% correct. And it's just strange, I guess, because it's like, it's hard to wrap your mind around the idea that like just how small we are, and just how established these whatever you want to call them, players, machines, and how like if they're larger than the nation itself, no wonder they are able to be so pervasive in the operations of one country or another. And it's a non-starter in a lot of ways, because it's like, if I were to grab somebody on the street and try to explain that to them, I would get tased, and I wouldn't be any closer to fixing any problem. So it is definitely an aspect of eating the elephant one bite at a time, but it makes for interesting research, and that's often enough for me.
That's right, 1,000,000%. Now, do you think just, I'm sure after this trip, your brain was you were probably not just exhausted, but probably left with some questions of your own, and even wanting to research not just history, but how that affects present time in the Bahamas. Do you suspect that these families, that this society almost, or these these situations are still happening on the Bahamas. We just are so distracted by, oh, it's just a tourist destination. It's this beautiful island, you know, nothing bad happens there. Do you think we're really jaded by how that perception is? And do you think that there's still criminal activity happening and that these families are really still ruling? Or what are your thoughts on the present day?
Well, I mean, I think it's almost certain that the families are still in control. You know, I would say I didn't, if I have any regrets about this project, it's that I just didn't hammer home that final point as much as I could, you know. I included a quote from one of the former, I think it's the deputy prime minister of the Bahamas, and he was talking about the fact that no, the Bay Street Boys are still around. They're right here. And I mean, they are, you know, the Sands family, the Simonet family are still involved in politics. They're still involved in Masonry. And I mean, there's been no political development whatsoever to suggest that anything changed. The only political development that any person would point to in the Bahamas that signified any change of power was that the United Bahamian Party, which was the Bay Street Boys party, that they ruled like literally, like they were the leaders of it. They were voted out by what is known as the Free National Party, which was headed by this guy named Lyndon Pindling, who was like a native born Bahamian. He wasn't from an English family or anything like that. And I mean, he's a huge hero in the Bahamas. Like the Nassau airport is Lyndon Pindling International Airport. But it's really funny because Will found this out, like, I think it was like 2 weeks before we released, but we found out that Lyndon Pindling was taking significant bribes from the Bay Street Boys while he was the prime minister of the Bahamas. And so, you know, I mean, you just have every reason to believe that the only degree of separation that changes, like, okay, they don't tangibly rule the political party, they just bribe whoever is in control. And since then, Bay Street Boys have been able to gain that power back in various ways. And I'm sure there's still leaders of industry. I mean, on Bay Street, there are still the same businesses like that were controlled by the Bay Street Boys 100 years ago. So yeah, I have no reason to believe that anything else has changed.
So fascinating. And I mean, that Masonic lodge was huge, and it's literally just out of nowhere. They didn't even like take down the, you know, the square and compass off of it, or even try to like massage it in and be like, we're not here anymore. Like, it's so blatantly obvious.
Yeah. Well, so the other thing is it's not even like, it's so big that like it's almost embarrassing. Like Bay Street is nice. I mean, they have a lot of nice things there because it's an affluent place. It's the nicest street in the Bahamas. They have like a, you know, Gucci and all sorts of jewelry stores and various other things like that. But they're one story. They're nice, but they're one story, as if you were in a walkable town. But then the Bay Street Lodge is 3 stories and it's bright yellow and there's a huge metal gate in front of it. And you can't really get even remotely close to it. Like it's so large. And it's weird. Like, I think we were just so strapped for time filming on the first day that like I guess I didn't notice it somehow. I saw a picture of it on the internet when I was like fleshing out some ideas and I was like, where could that possibly be? It's like so obnoxiously large. And when you see it, you just like have to like triple take. And once, I think truly it was like the sheer physical size of the lodge that I was like, this has to be part of the story. And that's when I went from there.
Gosh, it's so fascinating, everything that you guys were able to capture. When you left, did you have unanswered questions that came up as you were getting finished filming? And did you find answers to any of them, or kind of what's lingering from this adventure that you've been on?
Yeah, so the last day we were there is when I like basically wrote out the whole theory about the Masonic connection, and it was on the flight home that I started researching it. I think we got delayed at some airport. And so I just kind of sat there like Googling for a while. So really we we had the murder solved, you know, that like, okay, Harold Christie did it and this all happened and that. We went to the Bahamas basically with that covered, with the amount of people that we talked to. but really half the story was completely unfinished. It was just this basically unsubstantiated theory from me. What's interesting that I've just found in recent, maybe like 3 weeks, is that there was like the story just went on basically into the 50s. So there was Stafford Sands, who was heard in the clip that we played, who we think was like basically the leader of the Bay Street Boys. He was a politician and a lawyer. He was Harold Christie's uncle. He after World War II, there was a lot of Nazis that were basically on the loose. And he went about getting them citizenship and bringing them to the Bahamas just to like live there. And so he did that with one particularly, I guess you would say, like heinous war criminal. His name was Otto Skorzeny. He was known as the Butcher of Leon because he was like particularly brutal in like, you know, like murdering people during World War II. And Stafford Sands set about to get him Bahamian citizenship, and he had the power to do so because he was the leader of the United Bahamian Party. But what's interesting about Otto Skorzeny is that he has a lot of ties to CIA counterintelligence. Yeah, so like totally like on a completely unrelated project, I was reading about the CIA agent named Reeve Whitson, who was connected to the Manson murders. And some of his listed associates were Curtis LeMay, who was one of the United States Joint Chiefs of Staff during the Kennedy administration, who was involved in both the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Operation Northwoods, which was the attempted false flag to lead us going to war with Cuba, as well as James Jesus Angleton, who is the counterintelligence head of the CIA, who ran Operation Chaos, as well as, I can't think of his name right now. I think his name was Frank Barron, but I could be wrong on that. But he was one of the big leaders of like the mafia controlled Las Vegas. And so Skorzeny was connected to these guys, and Skorzeny was connected to Stafford Sands. And so that on itself is like just kind of weird, obviously. But then Meyer Lansky was also connected to the CIA through James Jesus Angleton, because James Jesus Angleton did this operation called Operation Underworld, which was basically the mafia working with the CIA to do various covert operations. They even asked the mafia to assassinate Fidel Castro in the 1960s. So the connection there between counterintelligence and the mafia is pretty tangible. And so, you know, the web obviously gets a little bit strangely bigger there. I don't know what to do with it because I just don't even know if there's enough information for me to start. But it gets larger and larger by day, unfortunately.
Gosh, that's wild. I'm not surprised, but I am surprised at the same time. You know,
Yeah.
it's fascinating how one murder can branch out so far, you
Yeah.
know, and touch so many different families, countries, organizations, agencies, and people, you know, and it's all really hidden behind closed doors. I'm so impressed with everything that you did find for it, because that had to have been so hard 80 years ago. It's
Yeah.
hard sometimes to find and uproot articles today from, you know, 4 or 5 years ago, because they do such a good job censoring things. And I'm sure this case, they really tried so hard to wipe everything off, you know, obviously manipulate history. So people just kind of go about their lives and forget it happened. And after decades, you know, I never hear anybody talk about this story anymore, but it's amazing that they don't, because it's a really big crime and it was never actually solved, you know, where there was justice to it. It was almost just this false flag story. Nothing came about it. And then they just kind of wiped their hands clean. We're like, all right, you go ahead and, you know, leave here. We don't want you anymore. And we're just gonna, you know, tell the public that it's done and over with.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's really interesting as well, because so much has been done to cover up this story, like within like somewhat recent amount of times. So we got access to a file from MI5 from 1943 that had been previously classified for 100 years.
Oh my gosh.
And it had only been recently declassified. I don't know how we got a hold of it, looking back on it, but it was a file that Pat Wertheim, who was our forensic expert, had been talking about since the 1980s. He talked about like rumors of this MI5 file, and we finally got it. And it'd been so heavily redacted that, well, not so much redacted as much as like necessary information was just exempted. That again, it was like basically useless. And there was a series of files done by the FBI that Pat had got a read on in like the 80s or 90s. He made a call down to the Miami FBI, and they were able to locate it. He had a friend in the FBI, and they said like, okay, like, come on down, Pat. Basically, he lived in Texas at the time, and so he flies out to Miami and calls his friend and says like, so what's the situation on the files? And he goes, Pat, I don't know what to tell you, but you created such a firestorm here that the files are gone and I have no idea what happened to them. And so he doesn't know, nobody knows, of course, what happened to him, whether it was the FBI who just shredded them, whether it was perhaps someone in the mafia who was able to get in there and get rid of them. But he asks this question to his friend on the phone in the FBI, and he says basically, so what you're telling me is that this story is so damning to the royal family that even to this day, when everybody's dead, that they still want to keep all this information quiet. And the guy basically just says, you're very perceptive, Pat. And that was that. So it's still kept under wraps to this day. And I should add that Darby Island is owned by the Christie family real estate company known as Christie's. And we spoke to John Christie, who is, I think, the great nephew of Harold Christie, if I'm not mistaken. When we started this whole process, like almost 2 years ago, we talked to him, and he, originally said like, oh, like you're filming there, like, okay, let's talk. We can set it up. If there's some publicity, we can work it out. And he never got back to us. And we called back Christie's, the company, and basically said, okay, we'd just like to follow up so we could go on the island. And the assistant who talked to us basically said, we have no record of you calling. We don't know who you are. And if you go on the island, that is trespassing and you will be prosecuted. So it's obviously still very contentious to this day. But, it didn't stop us. We went on the island nonetheless.
Yeah. Did anything come about that since they did say that? Did you get any, comments or anybody reaching out to you about putting that in the film?
Yeah. So we haven't heard anything from anybody. I don't know that anybody knows theoretically. We went there. We did a lot of whatever you want to say research. We looked at various like maps of the island taken from satellite over the years. And we found that there is a caretaker that either lives there part-time or full-time. It's a big island. It's probably a few miles in diameter. But we saw on the map, okay, like there's a dock and there's a house. So like we have to go not there basically. And we talked to this guy who was like a Nazi U-boat historian who went to the island in like 1972. He sailed there. And we got all the information about that. And so we went in with a plan. And so we hiked through, it's a jungle island, like all the way from the exact opposite side of the island. I also should add, we contacted a ton of services to like ask people to take us to the island, because it's like 30 miles offshore, the Grand Exuma, which is another tiny island in the Bahamas that you take a plane that's like about this big to get there. So it's in the middle of nowhere. There's no reception or anything like that. Nobody would take us there nonetheless. We were like, okay, we'll pay you like $1,000. Could we just go there and you pick us up? Nobody would do it. So finally we called enough people, and it was funny because we didn't set any of this up until like days before we were going to go, and we had our plane tickets and everything. So it was like falling apart in front of our eyes. But we finally called somebody, and they're like, you know what? I think my cousin will take you. He has a boat. Let me give him a call. And so some guy, his cousin, who just like owned a boat, was like, yeah, I'll take you. And we gave him $500. And he took us And we're on the island. We get there, we do all the footage on the like the castle that's on the island and stuff. We didn't bring a machete, which was a huge mistake because the island was incredibly overgrown with all these like really, really sharp vines. So we're just cut to pieces. And it was like 100 degrees and humid. And we probably hiked, I don't even know, like 3 or 4 hours to get there. And so Will was like, maybe we can like walk around the island, around the beach or something so that we don't have to hike all the way through. But that didn't work. Like we had all this camera gear and we were going to have to swim like 3 or 4 miles because we didn't have reception. We couldn't call our boat guy who's on the exact other side of the island miles away. So we were just kind of stranded and a storm was coming. So we're like, this is like doomsday, you know? And it was like a very like kind of difficult path to get there in terms of like, you know, we could have easily gotten lost. It wasn't clear. So we had no reception. Our camera guy's drone died. So we couldn't fly a drone out to like get him,
Oh my
like the
gosh.
boat guy, to like come follow the drone. So we're just in the middle of the ocean, in the middle of nowhere, with
Deserted
no
island.
contact. Yeah. And so what Will did was he swam about a mile in open ocean to go to this neighboring island where he saw a boat and a house. And there's like sea turtles. Like I'm not kidding. There's sea turtles swimming beside him. And he goes like a mile to this neighboring island and knocks on their door. As my camera guy and I sit there and wait. And he's so far out we like can't see him. But we finally, after like maybe like 2 hours, the boat guy with Will comes back and we were able to get in touch with them. But if not, I mean, we were gonna have to either like just get lucky and hike all the way back in the middle of this like thunderstorm, or we were gonna have to swim with camera gear for like a mile. So it was a very precarious situation that we thought we prepared a ton for, but we really didn't.
Stuff like that never goes according to plan. You know what I mean? Especially when, you know, there's not other people on the island that you can, you know, something goes wrong. You can't walk a little bit and go knock on somebody's door, go into a business and log
Yeah.
into Wi-Fi or use somebody's phone. Like that was
Yeah.
crazy. It was beautiful though. That footage was gorgeous. It
Yeah,
looks
thank you. It was a really beautiful island. When we got up to the castle, Guy Baxter's castle, which I mean that property is like, I think it's for sale for like $50 million. Like it's like
oh my
a
God.
giant island with this giant castle crumbling, but nonetheless still a castle. And it has this huge like stone balcony that, you know, after we'd been hiking for 3 or 4 hours through vines and there's wasps and spiders, we get up to the top of this and you can look out and see the entire island into the ocean. And it was like truly like the most surreal experience I'd ever seen in my life. My shirt was ripped to pieces, but there was nothing like it. Just feeling the sun and the breeze shine down and stuff. It was absolutely unbelievable. Darby Island's an amazing island, and I hope that there's a chance to preserve it, because it's such a beautiful building.
Yeah, it looked absolutely stunning. And you are working on a new project right now that I'd love to talk about a little bit because I am really excited that you're going to come out with a new film and a whole different story. So why don't we dig into that a little bit if you want to give people some teasers as to
Sure.
what you're currently working on.
Sure. Yeah. So trying to think about exactly how I want to approach this. Basically, it's kind of a broad historical revisionist project that surrounds Los Angeles, but broadly California, in the years between 1964 and 1970. And basically, it's the perfect kind of most concrete example we have of this mix of intelligence agencies, police, Hollywood, like popular music, kind of all working together in this web. And there's just like no shortage of really bizarre stories that kind of result from it. So I think I'm pulling from probably about 20 or 21 different books that I've read in the last year or so.
Wow.
But we'll be touching on like the murder of Sharon Tate and Charles Manson. We'll be touching on MK Ultra. We'll be touching on like the broader conspiracy to hook people on LSD, the connection that like occult societies like Ordo Templi Orientis, the Process Church of Final Judgment, and a few others, their connection to military intelligence. So it's just kind of this, it's going to be tough to like pare it down into like one movie, and I probably won't end up doing one movie on it, but it's just going to basically, the thesis of this story is like, we don't live in a world that we understand, and there's fingerprints of that all over the place, and here's all of them in this kind of bloody Valentine about this world that we think we live in, because there's such a contrast between what people's understanding is of like 1960s California as this kind of like last beautiful kind of Garden of Eden, between its like its livability, the way that everybody was like, it was like this bastion of the American dream, and it in one fell swoop, seemingly it just kind of turned into this like Babylon. And so that's what I'm going to do basically. And so it's going to be kind of an art house project in terms of like, we're going to prioritize the kind of not necessarily experimental, but really artsy filmmaking, because there's just so much beauty there. And we're going to mix that in with these really kind of unbelievable stories. And I think it's just going to be like, in my mind, I think it could be this like earth-shattering project if I'm able to execute my vision, that is.
Gosh, that's so exciting. All those things, even, going back to 60s, 70s era, that again, there was the propaganda of what we think we know happened and what we're told happened, this awesome, even like hippie movement, and, people were using LSD and raising consciousness, and it was like this beautiful peace, love, and joy time. And we seldom hear about all the connections behind the scenes of why that agenda was really important to proliferate on society.
Right.
And even why California is really important, a really important part of our nation, for all of these things to seamlessly come together in a way to make this agenda and, sequential ones throughout time happen. A lot of things that move east in the country or even the world, start in California. It seems like a launching ground in a lot of ways for these agendas.
No, yeah, it absolutely is. And that's why the longest part for me has been taking all of the info that I have and just like paring it down into one story, because the landscape will shoot itself. The clips will find themselves. Like, it's such a powerful story that it's like beyond me. It's just like trying to shear it down into something that isn't like drinking from a fire hose. And I mean, truly, like, it warrants like something much bigger than what it will end up being, which is probably like a 60-minute documentary. But like, I have just such, as someone who's lived in California and has been such a product of that time in history, I just kind of see it as like my own duty to kind of really reveal a greater truth about what it actually is. And so I've been putting my heart and soul into it, and I've got some really incredible people to work around me on this film. I just brought on a two-time best-selling author to be my creative director, who's going to design like the film score and a lot of other kind of behind-the-scenes aspects of the film. So someone who like I've like think of as an idol, that like I was like a fan of when I was like 18 years old. So
How cool.
once I have more info, I'll do a big announcement about that. But I'm just beyond grateful for what this could be, and so I'm going to see that it goes that distance.
And how relieving that you don't have to go to a deserted island on a boat with a storm to get footage.
Yeah, yeah, no, it's great because the only really like problem I have to navigate is like gas prices, you know,
Oh yeah, oh, yeah.
and finding a place to stay for, you know, a few days. But all things considered, the things that could go wrong are a totally different variety. They're much more controllable than before.
100%. Gosh, that's really exciting. We had talked very little for just a couple minutes about this on a former podcast, just tying into the Charles Manson side, and we had talked about a little bit of that in a roundabout way. But that's always been something too in my own heart, and it seems like even a lot of recent things that I study or survivors stories that I hear, there seem to be ties even to this day, you know, MKUltra being one of them, to that time period, and then to some of those players or families or lineages that are really still, you know, plain as day infiltrated into our society today, but we think of it being so in the past.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's truly probably the biggest historical can of worms that like we will ever find in American history. That or like Jeffrey Epstein, but um, the thing that's so strange about like Charles Manson is like, well, I don't want to say the thing because there's infinite, and I mean, just in the past month, I've probably read like 7 different books that like all theoretically should tell the whole story, but they don't, um, just because you can't. But the question of like, well, who is this like enigma of a man who clearly knows something? Like I mean, you know, from the amount of testimony I've read about people who knew him, he was this master hypnotist who had this like incredible grip of Scientology, and who like a lot of people say actually like worked for Scientology, who was also like he was just endlessly connected to these amount of things tangibly, not like anecdotally, you know. um he was seemingly so busy, um and was connected top to bottom with so many different people that it's just like I think mathematically impossible to know exactly who he was connected with, where it stops, and where the connections aren't true. And then what you don't know, right? Like what nobody was there for. Um, and so he will feature prominently in my next film because I mean the thesis that I have is kind of the events in his saga were basically the what would you say, they're like the capstone of this broader project of the covert endeavor to use drugs to control people. um and so it's like people like know him and they know his story and they're so caught up in the theatrics of it. But what my story is going to tell is that you don't know, you're completely missing the forest for the trees, in that his story is not about how weird he was. It's about what are all the things that he knows and used at his disposal, and how is he able to get away with so many things. And there's like a whole hidden story that um has to be addressed, and it so beautifully illustrates what goes on behind the scenes in California. And the end goal of it is not to solve the murder, it's not to answer so many questions about him, as much as it is to paint this picture that these single events that happen that captivate people for so long are actually just like music notes in a greater symphony. It's the point is that it's to show people basically that an event like that is a pawn on a bigger table, on a bigger chessboard. um and you'll never know that whole story, but what you can know is that there is something going on and you don't know it, but you need to start looking.
That's a beautiful way to put that. I love how you put notes in a symphony, because that's
Mhm.
really it, right? We see a note and we think that that's the whole story, and we're
Right.
not we're either not asking questions, because we don't think we have to, we trust what we see. And then again, we wipe our hands and are like, oh, they took care of that
Right.
note, not realizing that there's a whole song around it. In your
Right.
opinion, what do you think, just as a little teaser, if you have any information on this so far from reading about him, do you think he was counterintelligence? Do you think he was working for the government, or kind of who do you think Charles Manson may have been, or what are your theories?
Yeah, that's a great question, because, there's little parts of it that change by day, because a lot of this comes from like kind of anecdotal stories. I think my personal belief would be that he was a prisoner. So he had his own horrible upbringing, by no fault of his own. His mother was a terrible person who gave him up, and so he spent his life in the reform system where he was brutalized, and that impacted him for the rest of his life. I read a transcript from his psychiatrist that he had at the boys' reformatory that was written about him when he was like 16, and it basically says something to the effect of like, behind this clearly troubled boy who is a chameleon and is able to adapt to his surroundings and use people however he wants, is still someone who deeply seeks love and could be turned around. He's someone who just has a hole in him that's missing. And I believe that. I really do. I think that's like kind of the really sad truth about it, is that like, yes, I mean, a horrible person. I'm not here trying to make him a saint, but he didn't start like that, and he was someone who was opportunistically used. So what I mean by that is that by the time he got to Los Angeles in like 1964, he had already spent so much time in prison and I mean, he was a master of his surroundings just from figuring out how to survive on the streets, because he lived on the streets as a child. He studied hypnotism, he studied Scientology, he studied black magic. He was a master of human persuasion, like by the time he was 18 years old. There's a story with Danny Trejo, who he met Charles Manson when he was in prison in, God, like maybe it was like 1961, something like that. Manson was like 25 at the time. So he takes all these prisoners, Charles Manson does, and he says like, hey guys, would you mind if I took you through a guided meditation? And they were all like, yeah, sure. And so what he was able to do is he was able, just by like the sound of his voice, he was able to make them all feel as if they were on heroin. And these are Danny Trejo's words. Like I heard about this recently, like from his mouth. So undoubtedly he was a student of these things before he was ever involved in any sort of program. He was undoubtedly involved in the MK Ultra program because he was a prisoner during that time, where he was given likely LSD, but possibly other drugs. And he was able to kind of hone this ability to persuade. But I think that he has this parole officer named Roger Smith, who was connected to the CIA through the National Institute for Mental Health, and who basically kind of followed him throughout his time in California. And that's like the first point you have where he was directly connected to intelligence. So I think there was all sorts of like psychiatry programs going on at the time, through various CIA funded fronts, where they were looking for troubled people to conduct these experiments on. There was various experiments that involved like trying to induce schizophrenia using hallucinogenic drugs, getting people to kill. And there basically was this running thesis that you needed someone who already kind of had a working mental illness to induce like a greater mental illness. And I think once they like kind of got this guy, however it may have been, they were like, we've really got something on our hands here. And they continued to work on him. He made a series of visits to CIA funded doctors between the years like 1964 and 1967. before basically cutting off all ties from the outside world. And so I think that he himself was part of something larger that he didn't really have any idea exactly what was going on. That would be my candid opinion. But that might not be the whole story.
Well, it makes sense. It seems like the conditions were perfect for him to be a, in a sense, a pawn for a
Mhm.
lot of things because he wasn't stupid. It might seem like that from the outside, but he seemed like the things that he did want to learn, even if they were evil, he went all in and learned them. And he was a master at a lot of these crafts that he studied. So it does seem like it's kind of the perfect storm. And then his upbringing makes him that vulnerable, almost violent, well, very violent, but he had that, feralness to him where people like that are very easy to control, for better lack of words. They make very good candidates for something like that, especially because they don't have strong family ties. So if they die or they go to jail or they mess up on a mission, so what? There's not going to be people questioning it. He just looks kind of like a lone wolf, this crazy
Yeah.
weirdo who, was abused by his mom and went crazy. And it's a really perfect psyop in a sense to cover up really deep things.
Yeah. And there's kind of this interesting other component in that story that's like, actually, I won't cover it in my film just because it takes too much time. But it may be something that I deal with later. But the Manson family were very prolific drug dealers. They needed money because they were planning on this great exodus to Death Valley, and they were building a large cache of both weapons as well as like dune buggies, modified dune buggies to drive to Death Valley. And so they were kind of doing this large fundraising initiative in like late 1968, early 1969. And so they were very prolific drug dealers. And right before like the Tate murders, Charles Manson goes up to the Esalen Institute, which is like this kind of I don't know exactly what it was, like a psychiatry retreat for the rich and famous in Big Sur, California, where manipulating behavior through LSD was being studied through people like Aldous Huxley and like Allen Ginsberg and people like that. And he goes up there, and it's known that he gets like a ton of acid from there to sell on the street. Now, the Esalen Institute was heavily connected to intelligence. But the other interesting thing that there's a lot of questions involved is that there's very serious reason to believe that the people that were killed both at the Tate house and at the LaBianca house were involved in drug dealing and crime. So like Lino LaBianca, who those murders don't really get talked about because they're not as famous as like Sharon Tate, but that was a murder that went on the next night. And like a lot of people go like, I don't know why they picked that house. It seems kind of random because they drove for hours before they found it. But Lino LaBianca was connected to this mob-funded bank called the Bank of Hollywood. He was like their president, effectively. And in an interview that he did in like 1991, Charles Manson was asked about it. And they said like, well, you didn't know Lino LaBianca, why'd you kill him? And he says, well, I didn't know him, but I knew Frankie Carbo, who was a mob boss. And Frankie Carbo knows Lino LaBianca, so I killed him. And so the fact is that Lino LaBianca was in debt about $50,000 to Frankie Carbo in gambling. And so a lot of people think that that was potentially a gambling debt contract murder, but also his wife, Rosemary, was involved in drug dealing, allegedly. And then Sharon Tate, the murder of Sharon Tate's even weirder because Doris Tate, I should say, who was her mother, said in like the 1990s, yeah, I've heard from a very qualified source that the Manson family had been staking out Sharon's house, and they were assuming she wasn't there when they struck. They're assuming that she wouldn't be there, which means that the only people who would be remaining the house were Abigail Folger, Wojtek Frykowski, and Jay Sebring. And Wojtek Frykowski was a major drug dealer who sold MDMA. And he was associated with known members of intelligence like Pick Dawson, Billy Doyle, and Tom Harrigan. So there's a lot of reason to think that potentially Manson was involved with intelligence, maybe involved with intelligence through drug dealing, and that he was involved in kind of these underworld drug murders, which is an interesting theory. You can't really take it any further than that, but it's hard for me to throw it away.
That's really fascinating. And it
Yeah,
wouldn't surprise me, honestly.
yeah,
Again, he's like a great candidate for something to do some dirty work like that. So I
yeah,
definitely would not, pass it by that was, maybe a big part of why they needed him.
yeah, yeah. It's it's there's like just so many moving parts that it's like you'll never, in my mind, be able to find the full story, especially because so many of them are in prison and will be in prison for the rest of their lives, or they're dead,
Yeah.
in the case of Tex Watson, and Charles Manson as well. So that's why I don't seek to tell a definitive story. My point is to reveal the undercurrents of a large and definitely happening thing, which is more important than knowing precisely what happened.
Well, I'm super excited for that. And I know people listening are going to be also. And I'd love for you to talk about where can people watch your current film? And then where can they find you if they want to connect with you online, whether it's social media or other ways?
Sure, yeah. So to find the documentary, it's just on YouTube under Blood on the Palms, Palms spelled Palms, and that should come up first. It's it shouldn't be too hard to find, so long as it stays up. Not that I don't believe it would be taken down, but you never know. And
Right.
then on Twitter, you can find me at Blood on the Palms, same spelling. Um, I'm gonna be announcing the next film rather soon, so that's where that will be.
Yay. Oh my gosh. Last time, right after we recorded, you took a break from Twitter. And I had
Yes.
so many people be like, where did Matty go? So I'm glad that you're back on Twitter. And for people
Yes.
listening, I'll link his page below on Twitter so you can go connect with him, and I encourage you to. I will also link his film, his YouTube channel, so that way you guys can go connect with him there also. Please share, give it some love. It's incredible, phenomenal film that you do not want to miss. And if you want to get updates, I'll post them on my pages too. That way you guys can see, but go follow him so you guys can get the updates and support his work also. Matty, is there anything else that you want to say before we go, or anything that we didn't cover that you want to cover?
Uh, no, I don't think specifically there's anything I want to cover.
Okay.
I think I just want to say this, which is that I want to hammer home the fact that we live in a world that we don't understand. And for people that are watching this, that's very obvious, because you wouldn't be here if you weren't curious, and if something hadn't led you here. You don't get to this point by chance. And I want to say that if you believe these things to be true, it's not enough to know them. It's not enough to look for more things. It's that you learn this information with the eventual plan of disseminating it, because you knowing it as one person does nothing. And if these things are true, then things have to change. I'm not anything other than a person who just got to that point and realized that these things have to be known by somebody, and I can't be the only one who does it. It's something that I think is truly important for the future of whatever you want to say, the future of the nation, the future of life as we understand it to be. But whether it's through film, whether it's through writing, whether it's through talking to people, the culture that we understand is not a culture that was designed for us, and there needs to be a real counterculture, and that starts by just doing something about it. It doesn't matter what. So I just encourage you to, in some ways, help me. And so if you need help at all, if you just want some ideas, you want some direction, get in touch with me. I don't want to be the only one who does this. I'd be happy to help anybody get started, give you leads. If I can help you in any way in your journey, please just let me know, because it's important to me. And I think that with enough time, real consensus can be reached on this, because I started this process from nothing. and I'm on the verge of, something bigger than I imagined happening from it. And I think anybody else can do that. So, you know, I would just say let's start a counterculture if we can. It's happened before.
Well, I just want to thank you for taking that action, Maddie. You're young. This stuff isn't cool yet. There's still a lot of, we get a lot of flack for coming out and talking about unconventional or unpopular ideas or theories or facts even, So I just want to commend you because your courage is something that you don't see most people have in their whole lifetime, much less in their early 20s. And especially a man, I love seeing young men get into this fight, especially in men of any age, just because there do seem to be an overwhelming amount of females that are pushing for this information to get out. But ultimately, like, we lean on you guys. You guys are protectors, and you guys are the ones that that keep us going. So I just really want to commend you on that. And it's really important for younger generations to have somebody younger to connect with. And that was some of the best feedback that I got from having you on was, gosh, a historian that's not 90, somebody that's actually younger and can relate to more current events as well as understanding the past and isn't just stuck in this, monotonous type teaching. So the way that you educate also is it's entertaining and intriguing and engaging. And I just want to thank you in every way for just taking that action and for being that example, because I know that it's going to have a big effect on people who watch you saying, gosh, if he can do it at that age, and with all the things that he's risking to put this information out, then I can too. So I'm super excited to have you back on, hopefully sometime soon, and to get some announcements on your new film. But I just want to thank you for being here with me today. This was a really fantastic conversation. I think people listening probably going to have to go back and listen again and take some notes because there was a lot that we covered.
Thank you again for having me on.
Absolutely, my honor. And for you guys listening, share this. Again, go connect with Matty, go watch his film, go support it, share it everywhere you can. Go support him on Twitter, support us on all of our platforms. I'll have those links below as well. And thank you guys for listening. God bless you, and we will see you next week.